Hey everyone, we're back again for a little bit more of a jumbled up video. I can do some explanation on what's happening on here. Because as you can see, this car has no suspension, has nothing, no subframe, everything is gone. The transmission's right there on the floor. So obviously there's some kind of a lapse in what I did and what you guys seen. I actually shot a video on Christmas Day, which I might splice in here. You guys might see a little clip of that. Hey everybody, it's Christmas Day today. And I actually got a few hours to work on this car. The car's jacked up, obviously. I'm really crazy with like safety, I guess. I got like 2 wheels underneath it. And on Christmas Day I did the front suspension, everything came out of there, and today I just did the transmission. The problem is, on Christmas Day I started filming and I filmed the first half, most of the first half. Then I had some friends come over. I didn't really want to film my friends there, I kind of want to hang out with them, but I still wanted to get some work done. But of course, I want to update you guys on everything here, so I figured I'd at least pull the camera on, I'll reshoot this, and I'll at least explain what I did, how everything came apart. I'll show you the parts I took off back there. I'll have a look at the transmission. I'll have a look at the car, how it is. So let me pull the camera off the tripod. Let's have a look around and see what I did. Okay, so let's have a look at some of these parts because the car is kind of just an empty hole, although we will have a look at the car in a second. But let's do this in the order I took everything apart. It's not necessarily the way you should do it, just the way I did it. So a lot of the parts are over here. Let's have a look, check it out. Here are the knuckles, of course. My first step was the axles, to take the axle out. You got these splines that go through, they actually are what transmit the power to the wheels. But then there's threads here, and of course nuts go on those threads. One nut had to be taken off with heat, the other one came off no sweat with the impact. One thing I should note is in that video I kind of talked about like seafoam deep creep. It's just something my buddies told me about. I've never actually used a real penetrating oil, just a bit of WD-40, but that's not really penetrating oil. So I tried that out, just played with it on some bolts, on some big bolts, those axle nuts, and then some small stuff. I don't really know if it worked well or not. It's hard to know without a control. I mean, some bolts come off easy, some don't. It's just how it is. But I had a look at the bolts when I took them apart, and it did seem like it went down a couple of threads, and if nothing else, it kind of lubricated the threads on the end, the most rusty exposed threads, the ones that aren't actually in the nut, you know what I mean? It seemed to be doing something. I mean, you definitely want to use it on a gas tank where you can't use heat. But everything else, I'd probably just use heat rather than waiting for the stuff to seep in. But I guess really that's the application is for. It's not meant to be, not meant to replace the torch because it never will. So, something to think about. But continuing on here, once I got these axle nuts off, I did the wheel speed sensor. Let me pull you in a little bit closer. You can see these grommets here. That's actually what goes to the body, and then these connectors are inside the engine bay. These little brackets kind of go on just the body, just to hold up out of the way. You can see it's kind of in a U shape because it leaves some excess so the suspension can bump up and down and not pinch the cable. After that, I'll show you on this hub because it's flipped over. I just did the suspension components, so you get lower ball joint and you got the tie rod, just kind of pull them off. The bottom one the ball joint has a hole in the side. There's a cotter pin that goes through and it's a castle nut on that one. But the tie rod on this car was just some nylock nuts on that there. Then after those two were out, oh also I should mention, for these, you know, if you're trying to do this yourself, you can Google the 2-hammer method. You kind of hold one hammer on one side of the control arm and then hit it on the other side. The hammer on the other side kind of takes some of the shock so you don't crack the control arm itself. It's probably maybe a little bit more, you gotta be a little more cautious with these aluminum arms because, check it out here, I'll show you just quickly. The STi arms are aluminum, just for lightweight, for unsprung weight, and you kind of whack here with one hammer, and the other hammer you just hold here, just to kind of absorb some of the shock. It'll bounce off as you hit it. But back to these, yeah. So this is tapered, and you gotta knock that loose. And then I did the struts. The struts bolt on here. As you can see, you got your 2 bolts, 2 bolt holes, and then the top of the knuckle. This here is the reason why WRXs can't use STi struts. It's actually wider in this dimension on an STi than a WRX. It's just the knuckles are a little more beefy. The rears will bolt up though on a WX versus an STi. They are the same. The only difference is the type of strut they are. I guess maybe one's a little bit higher performance, and obviously springs are probably different stuff too. But they will bolt. So if you need to kind of adapt one to the other, you can make it work. I grabbed the strut just to pull the side to show you why they're different. Normally, like the dampening part, I suppose, would be in here, in this tube, and then up here would just be a rod, and the rod just moves down in the damper down here. These actually are an inverted strut design, kind of like a dirt bike suspension, how you got the chrome shaft on the bottom. You can actually see the chrome shaft. Let me get my light here. The chrome shaft bolts to the bottom there, you can see. So technically, actually, the damper is up here in the chrome half, and then this half down here is the shaft, and then this outside piece, I'm trying to be not so confusing here, but this outside piece here just slides over the whole dampening unit. That's why these clunk, and you got to kind of grease them. You can actually put like grease fitting. I actually haven't looked at the guide because I've never done it myself, but somewhere in here, somewhere in this tube, you put a grease fitting, and it just allows you to grease it and lubricate it so they don't knock and they stay nice and slippery for a long time. Just a little bit of a talk about these struts, just because I thought it was cool. I didn't know they were like this, and I hope I got all the information about them correct, but as I understand it, that's how they work. At this point, the knuckles would have been out of the car, the struts would have been out of the car, the axles would have been dangling, the control arms would have just been dangling there, the tie rods would have been just dangling and hanging out. With the control arms, they come out, they have one bolt here that bolts to the body. There's the part on the subframe that just goes around, bolt clamps it together. These back bolts are a little bit different. There's just two bolts into the end of the arm that go into these things here. The two bolts go there, and then this bolts to the body, as you can see, with these two holes. Both of these came out no sweat, never really gave me any trouble. One of these did have a stuck bolt, but I just kind of had to give a little bit of a finesse. Had to move some stuff out of the way, and it all came apart, no worries. Next up is the front subframe. I'm pretty sure it's what it's called. It's what I've always called it. Might be a more technical name on it, but it looks like a subframe to me. This big square here, you can see, that needs to be dropped if you want to take the sway bar out. I'm sure maybe there's a fancy way where you can just drop the front and pull the sway bar out to the front, but I'm taking it all off anyway, so I zipped that off first. It's got some few bolts. Obviously, it's a structural piece of the car, so there's some big bolt holes all around. Just general 19s and 17s, just, you know. It's a bit of work, and sometimes they can crack off in the body, and that's a real nuisance. But I got lucky. This car is pretty good for rust, like I said earlier. And yeah, it came away pretty good. Also, for the rack on this one, you take this plate off. Yeah, so you take this plate off, this other subframe piece, and the rack sits through here. And this is actually where it kind of bolts up to. In the order of things, this piece came off first, then I did the rack here. It's just got some clamps over it, and it bolts in. It's got a little bit of a bracket. The sway bars are just usually in with a little metal clamp over rubber bushings. The rack, of course, also has the U-joints for the steering column. They just got little splines. Trying to get this so you guys can see. Little splines and pinch bolts, and you just take the bolts out and you slide off, no sweat. So let's have a look at the car now. But like I just showed you, most of the interesting suspension and front end stuff bolts to the subframe, and then the subframe bolts to the car. So let's have a look, but there's not a whole lot to see here right now. That top hole is where the wheel speed sensor goes to the body, and those bottom two holes are where that bracket goes, just to hold the cable. I've got the brake line just tied up there. It looks like a stretch, but it's actually just held in gently. And as you can see, looking around the wheel well, there's not a whole lot else that goes on in here. As you can see here for the struts, on top there's only three bolt holes. There's studs on top of the strut top hats. Oh, check it out, and that's the nut that goes on it, 12mm nut. And really on the car, there's not really a whole lot else I can show you. Everything else comes off like with the subframe. And then after that I just did transmission. So I guess that's the next thing we'll have a look at here. So the first thing I started with, I'll bring you over here, I'll show you. We're in the interior here. This is the driver's side. This is where the shifter goes. There's a little plate that goes around that. You gotta remove that plate because there's a rubber grommet that's in here, and it's sandwiched with that plate. So in order to get the shifter out attached to the transmission, it's got to slip down through there with that rubber piece on it. Here's the rubber plate I'm talking about. It's sandwiched between a body and a steel plate. So in order for this rubber piece to come out with the transmission, you got to undo these 4 bolts and it'll slide through. On the back here I did remove the shifter bushing just because it's easier to have the bolts out and it just slides away freely. Technically this rod underneath here just goes into this hole, so you could, once you drop the transmission, slide the rod out through the front, and you could leave this piece here in my hand attached to the body. This is what you buy when you buy a shifter bushing for an STi. This is bolted to the body like that, and then it goes to that hole. Sorry the camera's not focusing there, but you can see what I'm doing. It also would come with these bushings in here. You had to take this, there's a bolt that goes through that, and it's just 2 nylon bushings that you remove and replace with the fancy stuff. And the next step was these transmission mounts. These fronts are 17s, these backs are 14s. You can kind of see the mount flexes independent of the transmission. It's all rubber bushed, this big bracket for the transmission, and the transmission is solidly mounted to those brackets. One thing I forgot to mention, the axles. I took the axles out first, and they're a little bit of a nuisance, so I find it best to do it in the car, because if not, the way you take the axles out, it's difficult to understand. I'll go explain that now to you. Here are the axles. Out there is the end that goes to the wheels. In here is the end that goes to the transmission. Here are the splines that go into the front differential, and you can see here, make sure you can see that, there's a snap ring, and that's actually how they're held in. Other than that, they're kind of just in there, and these snap rings just stop them from sliding out freely. But the way I've always done it is I wrap a rope around this green end here, this transmission part, not the boot of course, because if you pull the boot will come apart, and then you give it a quick snap and it should come apart. You also need to make sure that the axles are pushed into the transmission. If the axle's into the transmission, you need to make sure it's pushed in farther, not out. It kind of, I guess, unloads the snap ring. So then when you snap out to pull the axle out of the transmission, it gives it a snap and then it pops out freely. So once the axles were out and all those bolts are out that I showed you, the transmission just freely drops. I obviously supported it with a jack, and then you kind of got to lower it slowly. The drive shaft in an STi is a 2-piece, the one that runs from the transmission to the rear differential. It has a 1-piece, a carrier bearing, and then another piece down to the differential. Previously when I did this, I didn't let go of the carrier bearing. I don't really think you need to, but on this one I did let go of it just to have a little bit of extra flexibility with the drive shaft, because the drive shaft that goes into the transmission, there's no sense in me showing it because I got it plugged up with a rag, but the drive shaft just pushes in. There's no clips, there's nothing, that just slides in and out freely on splines. They do it this way I guess because the rear drive shaft usually doesn't flex a whole lot, and definitely not enough where it would pull out of the transmission unless you broke the drive shaft or something. There you go, you're all updated. Sorry I didn't bring you along for the whole thing, but that's how it worked out. We got to do a little bit of a different video style this time. I guess let me know what you thought about that in the comments or on Instagram, whatever. I'd like to hear some thoughts and feedback. For now though, thanks for watching. I appreciate you guys. You can check me out on Facebook and Instagram, just at Curtis Welsh Media. I post a couple different photos, just some random stuff. Alright, I'll see you guys next time.